Welcome everyone to this brief tour of an exhibition that was curated not so long ago at the Zimmerli Art Museum from the Dodge collection, the Norton and Nancy Dodge collection of nonconformist art. My name is Jane Sharp, and I'm a professor in the art history department and a research curator, or the research curator of the Dodge collection. And I'm speaking here with Ksenia Nouril, who is the Jensen Bryant curator at the Print Center in Philadelphia, and our co-curator, together with Julia Tulovsky, of the exhibition that is entitled Ilya Kabakov and Viktor Pivovarov, Dialogues, Stories About Ourselves. We had envisioned this. This was a series called Dialogues that this exhibition enters into. It's actually only the second in a series, which began with the joint exhibition of work, early work from the 60s by and 70s, early 70s by Lydia Masterkova and Evgeny Rukhin. Evgeny Rukhin. So dialogues, we envisioned when organizing this that somehow we would be able to move away from the general histories, the big, larger narrative histories that have overburdened the study of nonconformist art. Histories that focus on the Cold War, on larger political, you could say, and social consequences of life in the Soviet Union. And so we wanted to focus just on, take as it were, a small part of that history. The history that seems to be most relevant to the artists themselves, that is the degree to which they interacted with each other, the ways in which their interdependencies become dialogues with each other and are formative in the creation of their oeuvres. So why Kabakov and Pivovarov? These are well-known artists. And Ksenia, I was hoping we could speak a little bit about the importance of this gathering, this grouping of two people, and what we chose to include as curators in the show.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jane. And thank you so much, Zimmerli, and everyone who's watching. This truly was a wonderful collaboration among us curators, as well as the labor of love for two artists whom you say are rightfully very well known, but at the same time, underexplored. Sometimes with great attention comes a kind of superficial understanding of artists. And I think this was an incredible opportunity for us to actually dig deeper into them as individuals, but also as a pair and as a community. So I don't know what you think about that and how we came to express that visually in the show.
Well, as it turns out, when we were doing research on the show, I remember you pointing out that they had never really been paired in this way before, in a focused way. Of course, they're always joined in these larger exhibitions of Moscow conceptual art or nonconformist art. They're stars of this development in post-war Soviet art. But we had never put them together at the Zimmerli, and they had never been paired together. So we decided on the albums. We have a large collection of works by both artists, and we recognized we couldn't do full retrospectives. That would not be appropriate. So we focused on the album genre, for which they're both known distinctively.
And I think that was a great case for us to use as a jumping off point, because the albums, while singular artistic productions of each artist, be it Kabakov or be it Pivovarov, they also encompassed a collective experience. The production of the album was just part of the work of art. The other part of the work of art was the performance of those albums. And those performances would take place in small, intimate groups, usually among friends within the Moscow conceptualist circle that you rightfully mentioned, Jane. And therefore, the show becomes more than just about these two artists, and more than even just about their relationship, which has also experienced a lot of changes over the many years. It becomes an exhibition about friendship, about community, about collaboration. And that's something that we also drew out in the exhibition through various quotations from both of the artists that reference the kind of milieu, the kind of atmosphere that was in Moscow in the 1970s at this time. So therefore, the show has many different layers through which you can read it.
Right. And it, because it focuses on the albums, and the reception of the albums was such an important part of the artwork. This show was unusually challenging, I have to say, for those of us who know and have experienced the albums as presented to you, which Viktor kindly did for me over a decade or two ago. And it's just an extraordinary experience, both yours and the artists, but yours and the artwork, where you're able to actually sit in front of the artwork and take as much time as you need. The artists, and I imagine Kabakov did the same thing, Ilya did the same thing, was especially attentive to the viewing process, engaging your reaction. So you lose that in a show like this, where you see everything on the wall. But explain to me some of the choices that we made, and that you especially made, as you displayed the albums. Well, first, maybe perhaps we should talk about the entry area, where we literally have split the room into two. One side being for Viktor and the other being for Ilya.
Right. So when you enter the exhibition, you encounter a wall that brings the artists together. And in fact, the aesthetics of that wall very much mirror the exhibition catalog, with this thick blue line going in between the two halves. And so that wall introduces you to the two artists. It gives you their biographies, and it actually shows you several examples of works of art by other artists that are portraits of Kabakov and Pivovarov in pen and ink, in colored pencil, and in photography. And so once you depart from that wall, you can go one of two ways, as you say, Jane. You can go to the left and explore the work of Pivovarov, or you could go to the right and explore the work of Kabakov. But then as you continue around the central node of the exhibition, being that biography wall, you realize that they come together at the back of the show, and they come together through a couple of cases. One particular case really explicates what you just described, which is this performance of the albums. And this was a very important decision on our part as curators, because as you said, the albums today are typically exhibited as two-dimensional works on paper. They're framed under glass and hung, vertically on the wall. Now, we chose and took great pains to exhibit the albums as they were originally performed. So that would have been on an easel, propped up at an angle, in a way that would have created almost like a symphonic-like environment, with the viewers gathering around in a circle, encircling the album in a very intimate group. And so that's what we achieve actually at the back of the exhibition, where it comes kind of into a crescendo. And then there is one additional internal part, which explores a painting series by Pivovarov. And I don't know if you want to pick up on that work.
Right. Well, the Projects for the Lonely Man was a critical project for him, for Viktor Pivovarov, because it really drew album and painting together in a way that you rarely see in an artist's work. And I'm not quite sure that the same, I don't want to say equivalence, but the same kind of dialogue takes place within Kabakov's work, who moved very quickly to installation, the creation of installations that were drawn from, many of them, from albums that he had created earlier. But in this case, the room is organized so that you see a sequence of panels that outline in what seems to be a diagrammatic fashion the life of this lonely man, but it shares in the coloring and the delicate graphic character of the albums. And of course, the character himself is the lonely man, a kind of loose allegory of the artist or of the individual himself, perhaps, this particular artist himself. And we're given, in addition to those panels having to do with the daily life, images that are paintings ostensibly created for the lonely man's contemplation. So the whole idea of contemplating in one's environment, the intimacy of that experience that gives way to the experience of art is present in that room, is created by that room. It also is a threshold, I think, to an area of investigation that many scholars have explored, and that is the ways in which albums and these paintings become conceptual projects, may be understood as conceptual art. So that, for me, is one of the challenges that this exhibition still presents, how to understand this production as a form of conceptual art. And I'm wondering for you, where are you left with questions this show has generated for you as a scholar who works on them as contemporary artists, because they are living, creating contemporary artists today?
I think some of the more fascinating facets of the exhibition that came out, especially through the interviews by the two artists in the catalog, include the lifespan they put on their album production. So whereas Kabakov felt that his albums finished as a mode of production in the 1980s, Pivovarov continued to make albums well into the 90s, even the early 2000s, and would still consider the album as a practice in conjunction with his contemporary larger practice. I think that the decision of both artists to demarcate their albums within their own histories, within periods of their production, is very interesting and references the kind of self-historicization that happens and has been happening within Soviet Nonconformist art or Moscow conceptualism more specifically. As an art historian and a curator, someone looking at it from the outside, I can see connections well beyond the albums or well beyond the period of the albums. I think another great point in the exhibition is when we show a case of books that both artists illustrated for hire for state publishing houses, in which they use imagery, color palettes, and even stylistic choices that resonate with the albums. So here is an entirely separate and arguably official aspect of their artistic production that still maintains an incredibly close relationship with these albums, which were defiantly unofficial and, you know, in some cases, like for Kabakov, also periodized and sort of quote unquote completed after a certain point in time. And so I think drawing out the children's books and the similarities and differences between them and the albums is another really special aspect of the exhibition that we do through the exhibition of a large case with several really rich examples from the Norton and Nancy Dodge collection.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that is a huge issue that we constantly run up against with various artists in the collection, that they're identified principally as non-conforming artists. And I like that adjective, or that that it gives a sense, non-conforming as opposed to the label, gives a sense of what they actually had to live through and work through as artists who did work professionally and were part of unions, while maintaining what they argue is an entirely separate practice on the side. So it is confounding to actually find that there are these dialogues, not just between the artists, but amongst between oeuvres, parts of their oeuvres that they historically would wish to keep separate. Visually, we have to encounter and address as part of the same creative world, essentially. Because they're so materially and formally, and even, I think, symbolically sharing in the same area, realm of issues, having to do with the personal travails of the individual in this larger world. So one more question that I have for you. We had to consult with them on the restaging of these albums, and it might be interesting to viewers to hear what some of our decisions were, and what some of the instructions actually were, because working with living artists always presents that kind of challenge.
Yes, that is part of the fun, I would say, in curating an exhibition. And truly, again, is a collective effort. And I love that the collective effort of this exhibition among us curators, between us as curators and the artists, really is echoed by the larger themes of the show, which are centered around collaboration, in Moscow in the 1970s. And so I can be more specific and say that the artists have very specific ideas about how the works are hung, literally, how many inches or centimeters different works are hung from one another. We talked about the paint colors of the walls and how that is maybe evocative of certain moods or certain kinds of atmospheres that the different albums want to evoke. We also have discussed lighting in the past. I think Ilya Kabakov, who now practices with his wife, Amelia, as the Kabakovs, they are primarily installation artists. And so they have a very, very keen eye and sense of space. And that's brought a very enlightening perspective to the installation process as well. And I think that
sorry, it might be a challenge for them too, to hang these albums flush on a wall when they were created to be performed in a completely different way.
Absolutely. And you brought up sort of future research interests or sort of ongoing research interests. And I mean, one of my ongoing research interests and what I've written about extensively, especially in this catalog, is the albums by Kabakov really being a foundation for his later installations. And the way in which we see them today is really a fraction of what he envisioned them to be. And if you really want to get the fuller picture, you should look at them kind of alongside or with some of his later installations. They may not be a one-to-one correspondence, but it does give you a sense of the depth and the breadth that he envisioned, again, in his studio in Moscow, in a space where he didn't have the materials, didn't have the opportunity, didn't have the exhibition space to eventually build what he did, in immigration since 1988. Is a very fruitful, I think, pathway for continuing and developing future research, which is very much intertwined with the curatorial choices that you and I have just been discussing.
Right, right. Yeah, and I can say, I mean, Kabakov and Pivovarov are in that sense very different artists. That their attitude, as you point out, to the future or the relevance of the album to later production is quite different. And it's just interesting to me that in learning how Pivovarov wished to have his albums displayed, he was comfortable with the idea that they would be hung in a row. And I think what mattered to him more than anything is that the relationship between text and image be made visible to viewers, so that normally I do like putting individual texts together with the images to force, what that does is it forces the viewer to stop and read and look and think about these two as kind of symbiotic experiences, which in this case, we made a different decision. We decided to have translations published, and that the viewer could use as he or she walks through. So I think the albums in this case are primarily visually impactful, especially that's true in the case of Kabakov, because the images don't have as much text, if any. But even in the case of Pivovarov, we tend to want to pause and look rather than necessarily read. The reading is then a kind of corollary. Whereas you can imagine, of course, once we're sitting in front of the albums, we read and look at the same time. which is for me a remarkable experience. And I suppose that is what challenges me to this day, that this moving back and forth between visual and discursive fields, the interdependence of one on the other, is an area that I continue to pursue in my writing and research. Thank you so much, Ksenia, for joining me in this and sharing in the exhibition process, curating this show. The exhibition was organized by Ksenia Nouril, Julia Tulovsky, and Jane Sharp. The publication and exhibition were made possible by the Avenir Foundation Endowment Fund, the Dodge Charitable Trust, and with Nancy Rule Dodge as trustee. The exhibition was on view from November 2019 through mid-March 2020 and closed owing sadly to COVID. And I would just also like to add that this was, I think, the last exhibition that our former director, Tomasz Sokolowski, steered through before sadly passing away also in the spring this past year. So with that, we look forward to seeing you again when we open and virtually online at the Zimmerli website.